Hey guys, you're listening to the Energy of the Untamed Heart podcast, where we talk about uncaging your divinely gifted wild heart to be as free and expansive as you were born to be. My goal is to use our stories, guest interviews, and your questions to tease out what has been keeping your wild heart under wraps. I'm your host, Mielle Fox, and together we will shatter the myths of our old stories to set our wild heart free. So thanks for choosing you and showing up today. Oh, I just love that little sound. Recording in progress. It's so spectacular. So here we are for another episode of Energy, the Untamed Heart podcast. I am your host, Mielle Fox, and it is kind of humorous to me as we schedule these things, being a little tech challenged. My guest today lives many time zones away. So it's morning for Janet and it's evening for me. So she's all bright-eyed and bushy, and we'll just say bushy, not so bright-eyed. But welcome, Janet, so much. So happy to have you here. And we're going to have a little
Thank
chat
you.
about how do women of a particular age and generation get a little bogged down by all the
Mhm.
stories, all the things, and how can we help them walk their way back home? So welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I love that intro. I love that way of expressing it. That's brilliant. I'll have to get a transcript when this is released so that I can capture it for myself. Yes, absolutely. Women of a certain generation. I really love that expression because yeah, there's so many stories that we grow up with about what it means to be female, what it means to be any particular age. At 40 this happens, at 60 this happens, at 80 this happens, blah blah blah. And those stories, oh man, they can get in the way.
They most certainly can, and it's really fascinating to me. So I'm in my 60s, so I was born in the 60s. And so my parents actually came to the United States from Europe, and they arrived in the 50s, and they were a little bit later in life when they started their families. And it's so fascinating to me now as I see the stereotypes that I was raised with, and obviously that my mother was raised with, and I see a completely different world with my niece, who is now in her early
Mhm.
30s, and what her general I'll just say her general MO, the general way that she walks through the world and what her anticipations and expectations are compared to the stereotypes that I was raised with. And clearly my mother was raised with as well, which was the mommy stays home and births babies and
Mhm.
the man goes out and brings the money in. And then all of a sudden, who knows what happens when the kids leave. And in my generation, it got messy really quickly. There
Mhm.
there was a window where men and women were married and you stayed in it for better for worse no matter what. There was no divorce, there was no leaving. It was just suck it up and there you go.
Yep.
And that behavior
Yeah.
gets passed forward. In my situation in my family, my parents divorced after 28 and a half years. So they came to a new country with a completely different set of social and cultural standards. And they brought along with them quite a bit of generational trauma, of course, having gone through the
Of
war
course.
and a few other goodies. And then after almost 3 decades, they called it quits. And I think that was not only is it the usual divorce and difficulty for the kids, but I think it was really hard for my parents because it
Mhm.
was kinda like a rule breaker for them in their
Yeah.
upbringing. It wasn't done, it wasn't seen, it wasn't the norm. Now we toss the words around divorce and separation like you're putting cream in your coffee. I mean, it's normal,
Mhm.
but in my day, it
Mhm.
wasn't normal.
And I think this is such an interesting point, and it's really interesting. I didn't know that about your history, and my history is not dissimilar in the sense that similar generation, but I grew up with my grandmother living in the house, my paternal grandmother. She moved in when I was 5 because she'd been on her own, and my dad felt the obligation to support her. And so I was raised partly with her. She was very influential, and she was born in the 1890s. So, of course, her influence on me really sort of enforced those same sorts of stereotypes. And I was born in England, so my parents had gone through the war. Of course, they'd gone through the Blitz, etc. and everything, all of the generational trauma that comes from that. My grandmother had gone through the First War. She was actually at school in Germany. She was English born, but at school in Germany just shortly before the war broke out. She had to leave because the war was about to start. So those sorts of influences, they lurk, even though we might consciously. I was a child of the sort of, the hippies in the 70s. I lived in Australia in an area where we sort of took a little while to catch up. So by the time the hippie movement kind of got to where I was living, I was at the right age to surf that wave. And so there was a strong sense of internal conflict because consciously I wanted to be a free spirit. I remember vividly a moment when I just turned 2020, I think, and I was with my live-in boyfriend at the time, somewhat to the horror of my parents, and I was at his house that we were actually sort of sharing with some other students. He was a student at the time, and I remember vividly turning to him and saying, "You will never domesticate me. I'm never getting married." And within months, literally within months, within a year, we were married. And when that relationship eventually came to its natural close, which was 10 years later, I remember again, vivid memory of feeling completely trapped because nobody in my family had ever divorced. And then my older cousin divorced her partner. And suddenly it felt like I had permission. And it now, from this perspective, looking back, it astonishes me just how rigid those rules in my head were. And they were just thoughts in my head, but they felt like lead walls, like steel barriers that I couldn't possibly break through. So and the same thing happens with our relationship with our work. Women, our generation, and the women who come after us, we're trailblazers because, yes, for generations and generations, women have had to work outside the home in many, many different circumstances. But the concept of actually having a chosen career, of having a purpose in life that you express through a career, that's relatively new.
Mhm.
Our mothers and our grandmothers would have had to finish their career when they got married or when they fell pregnant. If you worked for the public service in Australia right through until the 1970s, if you fell pregnant, you had to leave. And of course, now we've seen a massive shift. There's a lot of gender imbalance still to work on, but the legislative framework in which those of us in the West exist no longer have those kinds of rules at play. And it's only been a couple of generations.
Which
So
is really
this
kind of
is brand
scary
new
when you think about
stuff.
it, because in the scope of
Yeah,
history, when you think about these shifts and changes only being a couple of generations worth of time, I mean, that's not very long. It's not very it's like a
not long at
blank,
all.
it's like a blank,
It
and
is. It
yes,
is.
yes, and,
It
here
is.
in the US, I don't know how much of the news you follow or don't follow, but, there's so much political upheaval over laws that were in place several generations ago, and all of a sudden they've decided, "Nope, we think we're just gonna reverse this." And
Yes. Oh
it
my
it
gosh. Roe versus
it
Wade.
just,
Absolutely.
we just sort of watch the television like, "Who who came up with that?" Like,
Yeah.
how can that possibly be? But yet it is. And so it's
Yeah.
really very interesting how the stories that we are raised with, if allowed to kind of run rampant, can really steer a person down a path where they feel like you described, these stories that I told myself feel like walls, like lead walls that I
Yes.
cannot move beyond. So a lot of what
Yeah.
you do, and
Yeah.
probably some of what I do in just different ways, is to try to open the door to show you could put a window in the wall, or you could take the wall down,
Yeah.
whatever you like. But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's the awareness to know that these stories are exactly that. They're the stories, and they were placed
Hmm.
they were in place at the time. I understand this now. I did not understand this as a child or an adolescent, but I see it now that the things that were put in place for us as children One, it was basically your parents doing what their parents and their parents and their parents told them. Like, nobody said, "Oh, here,
Mhm.
you can flip the script here and do it differently." So they just did what
Yeah.
they knew, and there you go. And, two, at the end of the day, when you really pare it down to really simplistic, what's it all about? It's in the best interest of attempting to keep you safe. Granted,
Well,
works great when you're
yeah,
3, not so good when you're 30
yeah.
or
Well, I think
60.
it's a combination. I think because a lot of it is to do with systems that have been in place for so long that they become invisible to us until we are forced to confront them, or they're
Mhm.
brought to our attention in some way. So one of the examples that I find coming up a time and time again with my clients is that feeling of, I look good on paper in my job or my career. I look good on paper, but somebody's going to catch me out. I'm this feeling that I'm a fraud, that maybe I'm not as great as the figures on the paper said, or it's a fluke. I'll never pull it off again. I get a great result. My sales numbers might be great, or I win all my legal cases, or I save lots of patients in my hospital, whatever it might be, whatever your line of work is. That sort of secret feeling that we feel kind of ashamed about, that when we feel that sense of, I feel like a fraud, imposter syndrome, whatever we want to call it, it's almost a shameful feeling, like I must be the only one who feels this way. But when you look at the way that the systems have operated, not specific individuals, but the systems in which we operate, the way that those are designed, those systems are kept in place. So whether we're talking about misogyny, racist systems, whatever we're talking about, those systems are kept in place by consistently demonstrating certain people don't belong in certain places. Women don't belong in the halls of power. Black kids don't belong in white schools, whatever it might be. And so this is all operating at an unconscious level. Because we as women we have witnessed that people being caught in the wrong place, and I'm using air quotes here, people who are caught in the wrong place can suffer lethal consequences as a result. So, of course, our unconscious mind is going to try and keep us safe so that when we get out of the zone in which all of the generations of women who came before us were told that your zone is the home, the kitchen, maybe some factory work or some nursing work or some teaching work, maybe, because that's a bit like childcare and caring for others. Those, maybe you can do those. But if you go into these other areas, which are the province of older, usually white men, then heaven help you, because you may get into trouble. You may become, you may be in danger. So I always say to my clients, it's really interesting to me how often someone will feel an intense sense of shame that they have these feelings. And the first thing I always say to my clients is, those feelings of, uh-oh, I might get caught out, imposter syndrome, I don't want to speak up in the meeting because I might get into trouble, I might say the wrong thing. All of those feelings are completely reasonable given the fact that your brain grew up in a system that said, if you get out of place, if you get out of your zone, we're going to come after you. You're going to be in trouble.
Right?
So of course, it's part of your brain trying to keep you safe, and bringing it into conscious awareness is often the first step. So actually, just that first step of going, oh, wait, it's not me. It's not a character flaw. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm not broken just because I had a I had a job at one stage. I've had a fairly checkered career in the past, and at one stage I was working for a local the federal politician who represents our local area at the federal parliament in Australia. And the first time, she used to rotate which staff members she took with her to Canberra, which is our capital, when Parliament was sitting. And when it was my turn, the first time I went with her, she said, I know you've been wanting to do some speech writing for me. We've got a debate coming up on immigration. Would you do the speech for me? And I cannot tell you, I had the worst migraine. I didn't sleep. I knew that I would do a good job,
Right.
I gave her the speech. I gave her the, I worked on it and I worked on it and I worked on it. I gave her the speech and she said, this is great. She'd made a few edits. Often she would do a lot of editing. She often wrote her own as well. But she didn't do much editing and she let me sit. She organized for me to sit in one of the press boxes. So I was actually in the chamber on the same level as all the politicians. I mean, it was so, so cool. And I sat there, and for the whole of that time that I was sitting there, I had that intense feeling I would be in trouble. She would turn around at some point and say, this is terrible. I shouldn't have let my staff write this. That somebody would come after me. And and I felt such shame that here was me, this, relatively high achieving in my role, doing sort of pretty impressive work for that, if you're interested in politics. And yet what I felt inside was I felt like I was going to crumble from the shame and the fear that I felt. Now, looking back, I really want to hug that girl and say, this is not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you. This is a natural, reasonable, rational response. It might be misplaced. It
Right.
might be the inappropriate coping mechanism in this situation, but your brain is doing a brilliant job of trying to keep you safe. It might be a bit confused about the scenario. It might be confused about these stories, but it's doing its best. And
Yeah.
the minute we give ourselves that grace to say, when I have these stories, very often they have been installed in me by a system and a set of institutions which benefit from my staying in these um, places.
Mhm.
Staying. I'm not a fan of the phrase staying small, but I know you know what I mean when I say
Mhm.
that.
Sure,
The
sure.
system benefits from us being in some way controlled by others. And of course, there are individuals who benefit from the system, but they are very few and far between. It's
Yeah.
basically, like I said, older, straight, white, rich men. Other than that, everyone else is historically marginalized.
So I think one way to start to change the whole concept of the larger portion of the collective feeling marginalized is to bring the awareness that we do have the
Mhm.
capacity as an adult to recognize and then
Yes.
make a choice from there. And that my phrase for that is that in getting caught up in the programming or the rhetoric or the societal expectations or whatever phraseology you'd like to place on it, that is in a way caging or trying to tame that which is what we come here to do. So we come here as
Absolutely.
an untamed, wild, abundant, expansive, joyful, energetic expression in our little humanness, and we pretty
Mhm.
much spend a lot of our life trying to unravel all the ravel to get back to that.
Mhm.
And so I
Yeah.
think where people oftentimes feel like, "Well, I can't," or "I had no ideas," because they really don't know. It's literally like walking with a blindfold on. You just don't have an
Yeah.
awareness if you don't have an awareness. You don't know what you don't know until you do. And so I
Yeah.
think step 1 is just to kind of shine the light on it and say, "Hey, you know,
Mhm.
there's another way to see this." And that
Yeah.
opens the
Yeah.
doorway to the awareness, which of course then opens the doorway to making other choices should one desire. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that awareness, it's very interesting to me because quite often I find myself working with people who've done quite a bit of work already. They've done some reading, they've done some self-help, maybe they've read a self-help book or they've watched a blog, a video or a YouTube channel. And it's really interesting to me that the awareness can sometimes land with that sense of, oh my God, how dumb am I that I fell for it? And I think that's such a sad thing when that happens. And so what I often seek to do is to again encourage people to recognize that This is happening to so many of us, and there are lots of
Everybody.
pathways out of
There
it.
is
Yeah,
nobody who arrives as a soul and a human expression to play here in the playground of Earth. There is not a single human who does not experience some level of what we're talking about.
absolutely,
It
absolutely. And
just
I will
is.
often say, yeah. And although I work with women, I will often say, the patriarchal systems, they are just as bad for men and boys as they are for women. It's just
Yes,
not my expertise to be able to
sure,
work with men and boys to
sure.
resolve their
It's
what arises for them.
absolutely, and I really feel a lot, don't get me wrong, an awful lot of my clients are women as well, but I feel that a lot of the same types of thought processes, beliefs, patterns, self-doubts, they occur regardless of gender, but there again is
Absolutely.
a whole nother level of expectation put on
Hmm.
women versus men or whoever it may be, that it's
Yes.
not okay or safe to express, or it's not it's seen as a sign of weakness, or it's seen as less than, or it's
Hmm.
seen as more than, or whatever the thing may be. And so I think
Yes.
a lot of what we talk about, many people in our kind of general area of coaching and healing and mentoring, it does definitely speak a lot of the time to the female population for sure. But I think it's really critical to acknowledge and say, this isn't just for the women. The reality is this
Hmm.
need to have an awareness of who you really are and how to really self-express who you really are unconditionally
Yeah.
without the judgment applies to whoever you are. Because the truth is, you're
Yeah.
really a soul in a human expression. And how that human shows up here, hey,
Yeah,
whatever the
absolutely. And
packaging
this is one of
is,
the
it's packaging.
Yeah, I love that. I love that way of looking at it. One of the things because I use one of the tools I use in my work is astrology, and I'm not an astrologer, but I have that training. Um, and one of the things I often say is the stars don't dictate who you are. You arrive on Earth as not as a blank slate. You arrive with preferences and
Mhm,
natural gifts and superpowers, and you come here to express those, and then you get piled on top of with you get lots and lots and lots of social conditioning of all different kinds. And the Jung said that the journey of life is the journey back towards the self, and I think that's a brilliant way of looking at it, that our work is to remove the
the
thickets and the
layers.
bushes and the
Yes,
foliage that has a sort of accrued around that central human entity in order to reveal it. And we reveal it in layers, not necessarily all at once, but it's a process, not an event. For me, the way of thinking about it is the sun, when we have really thick black clouds between us and the sun hasn't gone anywhere. We just can't see it at the moment. It's just hidden. And that process of removing the clouds, removing the thickets, whatever metaphor lands for you, there's some joy in that. So even the work itself can be a joyful process. So often for me personally, the way it works is I suddenly become aware of something that feels like it's blocking me. And then the process of healing that can be painful because suddenly I realize, oh man, I've had this story in my head. And of course, there's a part of me that goes, oh, Janet, you should know better by now because you've done this before, or you've worked with this stuff before, or whatever it might be. But I'm not the same when I'm working on a particular restriction or a story that has me stuck. I'm not the same person who worked on it last time. So it's a different iteration. And it's part of that process. And every time I do it, when I'm through the healing part, through the pain of that, confronting it and doing that shadowy work of drilling down into my subconscious to see all the murky, muddy things that are lurking in the dark, bringing that out into the daylight, the feeling on the other side of it is so worth it because it's that feeling of freedom. It's
mhm,
that feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm now free. Another piece of me has been liberated. Another part of me, another iteration, another And it's like the light gets turned up bit by bit by bit by bit until, I mean, I don't know that the process ever finishes. I have a suspicion that that this is a lifelong thing. And as long as we can approach it from the perspective that doing the work itself and feeling each step towards that state of liberation, that in itself is so worth it,
That's
because
the
each time
journey.
we do it, there's so much joy
Yes.
in getting to meet. It's like we get to meet ourselves. We get to meet that powerful, superpower rich entity that we came here to be.
Hmm.
And there's something deeply, deeply joyful about that.
Absolutely. So, to me, the phrase of it's the journey, not the destination, because the reality is the destination is your one-way ticket off Earth. There you go.
That's right.
That's your
Yeah. To whatever
destination.
comes.
So don't be in such
That's
a
it.
hurry. Enjoy the
Yeah.
ride, enjoy the moments. Even if the moments are a little, even in the darkest of moments, you can find something if you're
Hmm.
willing to allow for that. And I realize that there are probably listeners who are like, "Oh, hell no." And, I have, like many of us here, gone through several of the dark nights and, lost family, friends, all the things like many people. And in the
Hmm.
moment, yeah, it's very dark and it's horrific. But
Hmm.
on the other side, when you can look back, there is always something of value. There is always something, some glimmer of light that comes from it. And those are the pieces
Hmm.
to me, those are the moments, so that even in the darkest moments, even in the shadow moments, you've got to have that because it's what gives you the contrast to recognize and appreciate the other side, the light side. So
Yeah.
this piece of, oh, let's, walk around with unicorns and rainbows in our pocket and ignore all the rest of it. Well, that doesn't work very well. The reason that
No,
it's all
not
there
at
is
all.
because you're meant to experience it all. And part of
Yeah.
what I call
Yeah.
walking home to your heart, the journey of walking back home to who you really are, that journey, nobody said the journey would be, you know, the Wizard of Oz, but
Well, yeah.
it's a great journey, right?
But even in Wizard of Oz, they had to encounter the flying
Oh, that's
monkeys. They
right.
had to go through the field
Yes.
of flowers that would put them to sleep. I think this is such an interesting point that there has been this sort of uprising, I don't mean that, this rising up, that's a better way of saying it. There's been this rising up of the idea that painful emotions are a bad thing, that we're not supposed to feel them. And I think that's so unhelpful, because those emotions have a purpose. Anger,
Mhm.
the purpose of anger is to alert us to the fact that a boundary breach has happened and to help us figure out what to do about it. The purpose of sadness is to help us to cope with releasing that which no longer serves us. The purpose of grief is to remind us just how deeply and profoundly we loved the thing or the person that we are grieving, and how much it meant to us, so that we don't just have this shallow relationship with it. When my dad died, it's really interesting. I until my dad died back in 2010, I had had a really profound fear of losing the first close family member. And the older I got and the more it didn't happen, the more frightened I became, because I was like, I don't know how I'm going to cope with this. I don't know how I'm going to deal with grief. I had a fear of how intense and painful that emotion was going to be. And I was lucky enough to spend the last week of his life with my dad, along with the rest of my immediate family. He was in hospital, and he was a doctor himself. So he had said, can I, when they offered him hospice, he said, I'm more comfortable here. I feel at home here. So can I stay? And his oncologist went, yeah, that's fine. Well, you can stay. They knew it wasn't going to be long. And there was so much joy in his room from time to time as family gathered, and we shared stories and we laughed. My brother confessed something he did when he was 13. He's now in his 50s. I think he might have been in his 60s. I can't remember. That's terrible, isn't it? He said he confessed something that he'd done, something naughty that he'd done when he was a teenager that had backfired on him. And none of us had ever known. And we were on the floor weeping with laughter. I thought at one stage that we were going to get barred from the hospital. I thought they're going to throw us out. We were like a rowdy party. And it's still one of the most precious moments of my life. And that did not diminish in any way the grief. The
Yeah.
grief was still profound. And having had that experience, I now have a far better willingness. And it's much more easy for me to be able to simultaneously feel two seemingly contradictory emotions at the same time,
Hmm.
joy and grief, anxiety and optimism. It astonishes me that we humans have this. We have such sophisticated emotional and mental existence that we can do this. So I'm the whole, I love the way you call it unicorn and rainbows. I know exactly what you mean. It's the sort of like you have to stay happy all the time or else. And it's like, no, there are no happiness police in the sky who are telling
No,
you have to stay happy all the time and then you'll get your goodies. It just doesn't work like that.
no,
I think the key for me is being able to navigate our own humanness in all of its messiness. I had somebody say to me yesterday in a Facebook group in a comments conversation, somebody said that she felt that I wouldn't want to work with somebody with all of her ugly messiness. And I thought, how did I convey that to her, that she felt her messiness is too ugly for me? Because if anything, I'm the reverse. It's like I'm so passionate about all of us embracing ourselves and each other in all of our ugly, messy humanity. Because if we don't do that, then we're rejecting our humanness. And we are here to be human. We are here to
absolutely.
be
Your soul chose to come here
needy.
to have a human
Yes,
experience. So to
exactly.
avoid the humanness doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yeah,
And I think that the nice thing is I'm a big fan of rejecting the binary, the idea that either it's human and mundane or it's spiritual and holy and sacred. That to me, it's like any other binary. I think that the vividness and the color lives in the middle. I once heard this wonderful metaphor that, if you think that there's only black and white, the area between black and white is not gray, it's where all the colors live. I shouldn't be feeling this way. Then the question I always ask myself is, what additional, where is love? Where is joy? Where can I find that at the same time without making myself bad or a bad girl for feeling depressed or feeling sad or feeling angry or whatever it is I'm feeling? That richness, I think our capacity to accommodate that richness does improve with age. I think I can do it now in a way that I couldn't do it when I was 20. And I think that's part of this journey that we are all on, that we acquire these skills and abilities to comprehend ourselves in a more nuanced and sophisticated way, that we have all of these rich things within us. And as you
absolutely.
say, that's what we came here for.
It's what
The
we
whole
came
point
for.
of the
Yes,
journey is
yes.
to have all these things. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a great metaphor. There's a metaphor that goes around every so often around the idea that before we come to planet Earth, we want to have a human adventure. So we design it like a computer game. And we design in all of the good stuff, all of the challenges, all of the glorious moments of joy, all of the things that we're going to encounter. We set up all of this adventure before we get here. And then in order to actually enjoy the adventure fully, we wipe our memory so that we don't remember what's going to happen. And if you've ever played a computer game, so this is going out to all the gamers out there who might be listening, if you've ever played a computer game, you know that if all you ever get is spoilers, or if you know exactly what's going to happen next, then you lose some of the edge to it. That any game is always the most fun the first time you play it, when you don't know what's going to happen, you don't know what's going to be around the next corner,
Yeah.
and you have to learn skills and you have to find the treasure so that you can take on the boss challenge. And I think I really love that way of looking at life, that because I think it lets us off the hook a little bit for the idea that we're supposed to do it perfectly. Because in a computer game, you're going to screw things up the first time you try them. You're never going to play it perfectly. You're never going to get a perfect score the very first time you go through it. And life is like that. We're going to take detours and cul-de-sacs, and we're going to sometimes take the scenic route to get somewhere rather than taking the direct, from point A to point B. And that's where all the juice exists.
Yes.
And
And
the
I
more
think
we can embrace that,
absolutely. And I
the
think
better we'll
that
be.
it's just another way of saying when you can be open and spacious to possibility, to things that don't necessarily need to look just one way or the way you believe they need to be or look, then when you can be
Mm-hmm.
curious like a child and expansive and open and willing to receive whatever is coming with
Yes.
not with trepidation, like, "Oh my gosh, what's coming?" But more like, "Woohoo, can't wait to see what's coming." Then
Yeah,
the
yeah.
that old phrase of "the world is your oyster," absolutely. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Agreed.
fabulous.
Agreed.
Oh,
I love it.
fun talk. This has been a very, very fun talk. Yes. Tell
Oh,
us where
it's
can
always
folks find you for more of this fun talk? Where's the
well, the
best place?
place that I hang out the most, probably the place I hang out the most is Facebook. And so people will find me there. And I think you'll have a link in the show notes for that. I do have a website, and it's janettedalgliesh.com. And I know that there are about 1,001 different ways to spell all of that. And I won't spell it out for you. So again, I know
I'll
you'll
put it
have
in the
the link in the
notes.
show notes.
Yes.
But for anyone who wants to get in touch, Facebook is definitely the way to go. Just send me a direct message on Facebook, or find me there and lurk, and that's
And
fine. Lurk. It's all
love
good.
it. Well, thank you, thank you, thank you for your time.